Hi scientists! Today we're going to start the first mystery of our new unit. And the question that Mystery Science asks us is, why would a hawk move to New York City?
Hi, it's Doug. A few weekends ago, I was at a park in the city with some friends of mine, and we had some food with us. And like you might expect in a city park, there were a lot of bees. Pigeons. When we got there, my friend was like, "Ugh, I hate pigeons." Now, I don't know how you feel about pigeons, but we all know pigeons are the most common bird you find in a city. My friend was getting a little annoyed that day because every time he'd turn away from his food to talk to me, these pigeons would come up and try to grab at it. My friend had to keep shooing them off over and over. But it didn't matter. The pigeons kept coming back. So finally at one point he yelled, "Get away!" And every single pigeon took off. My friend was like, "Ha! Finally!" But I realized something. I said, "I don't think it was actually you who scared those pigeons off." "Look up," I said. And sure enough, we both looked up, and there was this. A red-tailed hawk circling overhead. "Whoa, is that a hawk?" my friend said. "I didn't know those lived in cities." "How'd you know to look for that?" There were a couple clues. First of all, if you've ever spent time in a city, then you know it's actually pretty hard to scare away pigeons. They're not afraid to come right up to people, probably because they've learned we have delicious, tasty treats. The second clue is that even though pigeons live in cities and seem not to be scared of anything, they do have one thing they're really scared of. And that's their predators, animals which hunt and eat them. Everyone knows about city pigeons, but people are surprised to find out that hawks and falcons are starting to live in cities now too, and they're doing really well. Some city hawks are even famous, like this red-tailed hawk who lives in New York City's Central Park. The people of New York City love this guy. They've named him Pale Male, because he's a boy and he has some pale-colored feathers on his head. In order to live in a city, there are really only a couple things that a predator like Pale Male needs access to. In the wild, hawks prefer high places to build their nests, places like the side of a cliff. But Pale Male has figured out that in the city, skyscrapers work just as well for that, so no problem. And then of course, any predator needs prey, the animals that it eats in order to stay alive. In the wild, hawks prey on small birds. You know cities are full of those. So it's surprising to find wildlife other than pigeons living in cities. But you can find wildlife like hawks and falcons. And that's because every animal has some other living things that it's linked to. Pigeons are preyed upon by hawks and falcons. So where there are pigeons, there are hawks and falcons around too. Or as another example, consider this squirrel. Think about what kind of living things it's linked to. Whenever you see an animal, you could always discover the links to other wildlife by asking two simple questions. What does it eat? And what is it eaten by? I call these the food chain questions. So think about the squirrel. If you saw this squirrel in your neighborhood, which living things should you also be able to find near you, just by asking the two food chain questions?
Which living things should you be able to find near you next time you spot a squirrel? Ask the questions, what does it eat? What is it eaten by? Here's what we think. A squirrel eats nuts from trees such as acorns. So wherever there are squirrels, there are oak trees, trees that grow acorns. A squirrel is eaten by birds of prey like hawks, falcons, and eagles, and other predators like cats. So wherever there are squirrels, you should be able to spot those animals too.
With any animal, by asking the two questions, what does it eat, and what's it eaten by, you can always spot a link that the animal is part of. You might have heard that scientists call this a food chain. Now here, the squirrel is in the middle of the food chain. What does it eat? Acorns, which grow on oak trees. What's it eaten by? There are a few different predators that eat squirrels. A cat is one example. So there's a food chain linking cats to squirrels to oak trees. Now, even if you're in a place where you don't think there's any interesting wildlife, I think you'll be surprised by what kinds of animals and plants you can find if you think about the food chains. You might even find plants and animals you didn't even know existed. One of my favorite tricks for finding creatures is to look for rotting logs on the ground. If you carefully roll one over, like this guy's doing here, there's almost always some kind of interesting little bugs, like this little millipede here, or sometimes toads and tree frogs too. For example, I live in a city. Next to my apartment is this little yard that I share with our neighbors. Now, I really never would have thought anything interesting could live in this little yard. But a few weekends ago, I noticed there was an old board lying on the ground, probably left over from construction. I thought, well, let's see if my log rolling trick really works. Sure enough, when I rolled it over, I found this. It's a beetle. They have these little pinchers. And I wondered, well, what do they eat? When I went online and looked up what they ate, I read that they like to find and eat the caterpillars of moths. When I saw that, I was like, wait a second. There's a link I didn't even realize. Living near my apartment are moths that fly into our stairwell every night outside our front door. When I get up in the morning and I walk down the stairs, I always wind up seeing those interesting moths on the walls. So I suddenly realized all those moths I'd seen living in our stairwell had hatched from caterpillars that didn't get eaten by the beetles in the side yard. I thought, okay, so that's what the beetles eat. But then I asked myself the other food chain question. What are the beetles eaten by? As I kept looking under that wooden board, I saw something else too. It tried to hide from me, scurried and buried itself in the mud. I was like, wait, what is that, a snake? But it had legs. I couldn't tell what it was at first, but as I carefully picked it up, I realized it was this. Do you know what this is? It looks a bit like a lizard, but it's not a lizard. It's called a salamander. Salamanders are amphibians. They're like frogs with long tails. They even start out in life as little tadpoles. I was so excited to find this. I couldn't believe I could find a salamander living in the city right outside my window all this time. When I looked them up on the internet, guess what? I found out they eat beetles. So there was an entire food chain happening right there in my little yard in the city. Salamanders, which eat beetles, which eat tiny moth caterpillars. All of this happening under a wooden board in my yard. What could you find where you live? Well, try my trick of looking for a log to roll over. Don't be scared, there's usually very little that can hurt you. If you do have any wildlife in your area that could be harmful, talk about that with a teacher or a parent. You might need to shake the log with your foot first. And always be sure to be gentle when you roll a log over. Place it back carefully. You wouldn't want to crush any little salamanders or beetles that live under it. Whether you find something under a log, or in a tree, or in the grass, when you do find a creature you're interested in, remember to ask yourself the food chain questions. What does it eat? And what's it eaten by? When you ask these questions, I guarantee you it will lead you to some other interesting links. So take a moment now. What are some animals you think you might be able to find in your neighborhood? And what if you ask the food chain questions? Does it lead you to think of any new animals to look for?
Okay, scientists, so I would like for you to do some exploring. I would like for you to go outside, and I want you to observe what animals might live in your neighborhood. It says to come up with 3 places where you could look. You don't have to turn a log over. I was just sitting on my back porch, and I was able to observe a dove, and it was on the fence, and so I could use a dove because that's something that lives nearby. If you are going to turn over a log or a rock, I'd like for you to be mindful that we're not going out to destroy, like we're not going out to kill bugs or to harm any animals. Our job as scientists is to make some observations. So 5th graders, I'd like for you to, 1, make sure that you check with an adult to get permission to go outside. And then I'd like for you to go outside. It can be your backyard. It could be your front yard, a side yard. Maybe some of you have access to a nature trail, but please make sure that you do have permission from an adult. I don't want you just to wander off and nobody knows where you are. That's not safe. Your goal is to observe. I want you to observe. Do you find that you can observe a squirrel or a worm or a beetle? And 5th graders, if you find something and you're not quite sure what kind of beetle it is or what kind of bird, then later when you get back, you can, on your Chromebook, you can look up what's a bird in Missouri that has brown and orange. Okay? So once you find, you're going to, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot this. Take your science notebook with you and your pencil. Remember, we set up our notebook of observations. And so I'd like for you to record your observations. Maybe as you're watching and you're watching from a distance and you can see a squirrel, write down your observations. What are some things that the squirrel is doing? After you have made your observations and you found a living thing that you're observing, you're not out to harm it, you're not out to get close, I don't want you to get hurt, but I want you to then think about, what does it eat and what's it eaten by? And if you don't know for sure, then I want you to go online. And I'd like for you to use your Chromebook, and I'd like for you to write all of this information in your notebook first. So you're going to record your observations. What is the living thing that you've been observing? And then I want you to, in your notebook, write what does it eat and what's it eaten by. Once you have done your exploring and your observing, and you've written your information in your notebook, you're going to need to come back to Schoology because you're going to post what you found out in a Schoology discussion. So once again, please make sure that you get permission from an adult. Your goal is to be as kind and gentle as possible. You're not out to destroy habitats. You're not out to kill any living thing. And then please record your information in your notebook and come to Schoology and post in the discussion.